Hello everyone, welcome to the lecture of week 9. In this lecture we will summarize whatever we have covered so far in previous 3 lectures, and we will also talk about a small assignment which you can do using some sort of data analysis, and we will also discuss about how we can solve this assignment in the next class as well. So, this week primarily we have talked about socioeconomic impacts and vulnerability to extreme events. So, as we from this figure it is also very clear that when we are moving from 90s to 80s, 90s, then 2010 and 2020 and onwards, what we see that the climate extremes are also increasing. Climate extremes cause several different types of socioeconomic impacts, which is also growing, and we have also seen some of the indirect effect of climate extremes increment. For example, mental health, for example, physical health, social behavior. So like that we have all these areas we have touched in this particular week, and we have also described several different types of case studies, how they have dealt with those kind of scenarios, what are their post recovery or post disaster different approaches they have adopted to overcome the issues which are created by climate extreme events like that. So, in the first lecture of this week we have primarily centered around socioeconomic impact. So, what are the climate extremes effect on, if you convert into different economies, monies like that, how they have disrupted direct cost, indirect cost or intangible cost like that. For example, if you are talking about direct costs, we have discussed about infrastructure damage, property loss. When we are talking about indirect cost, we are talking about, let us say, business disruptions, industrial activity which has been disrupted. We have also talked about Thailand example, for example. Then we have also talked about, let us say, the loss of productivity of agricultural yield, that is going to be affect the food security of that particular area. Supply chain interruptions, for example, let us say if you talk about flash flood conditions in the mountainous region, Uttarakhand, Himachal, northeastern regions like that. What we have see more often that those areas, the infrastructure has been damaged, and therefore because of the climate extremes, several supply chain system has been also disrupted. For example, there are several essential services that needs to be provided to those places, medical services, food services, food supply like that. So, these are the supply chain interruptions, also some sort of indirect costs which has to be we have reflected when we have seen such kind of any climate extreme disaster in certain places like that. There is an intangible cost. So, when we are talking about direct and indirect costs, that might need some times to replenish or further regrow again in that region. But there are some costs which are intangible loss. Suppose mortality, people have been suffered or killed because of certain disaster, that is intangible cost of these climate extreme disasters. Loss of cultural heritage of certain region, that is also sort of intangible loss or cost which is basically because of the climate extremes, or for example environmental degradations in certain regions. So, these are the some of the post effect of any particular climate extremes in a particular socioeconomic conditions of certain region. How do we estimate these costs? Basically direct business interruptions and indirect costs based on certain physical parameters, building, infrastructure, productions like that. We also talk about indirect damage costs, for example, productions losses, supply and customer chain interruptions or directly affected by these hazards like that. Then we have also talked about some sort of risk mitigation cost. After the post effect, we have, there are some sort of direct costs which we need some sort of money to regrow those things again. Setup of the infrastructure, operation maintenance cost, indirect, which are induced costs in other sectors. And there are some intangible costs like environmental damages due to development of some sort of infrastructure, or due to change in the agricultural practices in a certain region because of the climate extremes conditions. So, these are some of the factors which we think when we are talking about socio-economic condition of a certain region. So, there are several methodologies. We have talked about very simple methodologies to assess the cost of a particular climate extremes in a certain region. For example, DALA assessment we have talked about, where we are looking at 3 primary sectors: infrastructure, agriculture and the service sector. We collect the data post survey before the climate extreme conditions and after the climate extremes conditions, like that, and we basically compare the loss of which happened because of that particular event, and that we calculate the comprehensive loss evaluation, and then we try based on that numbers we prepare some sort of guide for emergency response systems, like that, or let us say long term recovery plans. There are certain inputs outputs models, for example initial disruptions, then we have sector which are interdependencies on that particular disruptions, then we have some sort of cascading effect, which is basically cascading effect to multiple different sectors, and then we basically calculate how many sectors has been affected because of this cascading effect, and then their multiplier effect, like that. That is basically we also take into account. So, here basically we are talking about some direct cost estimation of that disruptions. Here we are primarily looking at the indirect and the cascading effect of certain climatic extremes in a certain regions, like that. When we are talking about so let us say if you have already modeled this, how do we generate the historical scenarios, or let us say how do we generate the socio-economic model for that particular regions. So, that is we call catastrophe modeling, where we have some sort of historical data set of climate extremes events, we have geographical information, we have advanced simulations, it could be your climate simulation, hydrological model, or kind of advanced statistical tools or machine learning, like that. Then based on those data set and knowledge, we try to predict the climate extremes, severity level, outcome variability, frequencies, probabilities, like that. Once it is set up, then we will try to calculate what is the risk management, socio-economic model, disaster preparedness plan, insurance premiums or resource allocations in that particular region. So, that is how basically we try to look at how we can manage a particular scenario based on these the outcomes which we have learned from a particular historical events, like that. So, after this discussion in the first lecture of this week, we have talked about 2017 Hurricane Harvey. So, where we have talked about there was a hurricane scenario in United States, that is basically unprecedented rainfall and flooding we have also reported, and that has been estimated around $125 billion damage caused by that particular Hurricane Harvey in that particular regions, like that, in September 2017. Started in 25th of August 2017, and the total loss we have during that particular period is around $125 billion. So, what we have observed during that particular event is the infrastructure was damaged, significant damage we have reported in transportation, utilities, homes, like that. There was a transportation disruptions, major highways were disrupted because of the flooding conditions, extreme rainfall conditions. There is a utilities outage, for example, power outages we have seen, water issues we have seen, and that leads to be a very significant problem created in that particular period of time. Then because of this we have also seen infrastructure damages, energy sector disruptions, and that is basically we have seen increased insurance claims because of this multiple cascading effect. People have started claiming the amount which they have lost during that particular extreme events conditions. So, post Harvey recovery overview was uh, in this particular scenario we have learned that community resilience, we should have a better plan to actually educate community and towards the resilience of the climatic extremes. We should have a better urban planning, because if we have planned better urban areas, then we may mitigate the effect of extreme flooding disasters, for example, or let us say we have better stormwater sewage system, or let us say we have better rainwater harvesting system, or let us say we have area that basically can collect excess amount of water during extreme rainfall events like that. That can be used to sort of structures is required when we are developing some urban spaces or urban areas like that. There are flood controls. So we have also talked about this is a flood scenario. We have also talked about in heat wave scenarios. When we are talking about urban planning, we are also should look at how much percentage of the vegetation cover we should have at least in those particular regions, so that it can be a balanced conditions. It should not have urban heat island effect like that. Then flood control infrastructure we also look at, so that we can control the floods for prevent future flooding in those areas. Flood insurance, insurance payouts and federal aids, like some of the insurance or financial mechanism where we can provide some sort of compensation or insurance premium or payouts after the particular disasters like that. So, overall in this particular Harvey hurricane disaster, we observed that there is a significant loss of personal property and commercial property, and there is a loss of infrastructure and business interruption, which we have already also reported. It is estimated to be around $30 billion to $40 billion amount of personal property has been lost during that particular event in that particular period of time like that. Then we have talked about the another case study of 2011 Thailand floods, where we started where we talked about the Thailand floods, which was started in July 2011 and was concluded in January 2012. It's a very prolonged period of flooding conditions, and massive areas, very large areas in Thailand was submerged because of this extreme disasters. So, what we have observed because of these particular Thailand flooding conditions, the automobile industries, electronics industries, other industries, and several indirectly linked these industries were disrupted, and because of this disruption we have already seen a significant decrement in productivity of different kind of electronics and automobile parts and things in that from that particular areas like that. That has basically direct consequences on the global supply, and because of this, because it provides these parts and different electronic items to different parts of the country or through different parts of the around the globe. So, total productivity of that particular electronic items which requires those tools and smaller components, which has been also dropped, and that is basically kind of a linked effect which was happened somewhere else, but their effect was seen multiple areas or global coverage of that particular areas like that. So, this is it can be shown by this particular graph as well. If you look at particularly the period where this extreme events were started and concluded, we can see that there is a clear dip of the industrial economies monthly export growth by key markets in 2011. What was the flood recovery strategy? In this particular case, we have seen that we need to have an infrastructure upgrade. We have to have early warning systems. We should have economic and support and recovery, so that let us say it should not be the effect of these extreme events should not be very prolonged or very cascading or transferring to one into another like that. We should stop somewhere these effect and then try to recover that particular conditions as soon as possible. It's like that. So, some of the structural and non-structural solutions are there which can be adopted, and we have learned from that particular case studies that okay, if these things were there, probably the impact of these particular flood events were not that much significant, which we have seen so far in the historical period like that. What is the long term economical recovery strategy? Based on these case studies, we have talked about smart urban planning. There is a flood resilient buildings, strong foundations, renewable energies. Those are the sectors which we need to we have to give more attention to those areas. We have to diversify the local economies. It should not be dependent upon only one parts. Suppose if flood or heat waves occurs, the whole economies will be disrupted, and that global supply will be disrupted like that, and for that particular local areas that economy will be suffered. Therefore, it has to be some sort of diversified local economies. We should have a technological sector investment so that we can diversify these economies. We should have a drought resistant cropping agricultural practices, so that if let us say more persistent droughts will occur, we can actually save that crop, or we should not have a very significant dip in the crop yield or productivity like that. Then we should have some sort of retraining program of workers or laborers or like that, and then we can have some sort of ecotourism development for further economical diversifications like that. And the more importantly, we should have some sort of enhanced early warning system that should contain the community based warning system, SOS based warning system, that should have an integrated disaster management risk, that should have the advanced meteorological technologies that can give us more reliable, more accurate forecast values like that. So, this was we have discussed about the lecture 1 of this particular week, the socio-economic impacts primarily. In the lecture 2 of this particular week 9, we have discussed about what is the health and social impact of climate extremes. For example, there are several vulnerability factors: demographic, geographical, socio-political, socio-economic, health system, gender inequality. These are some of the vulnerability factors which needs to be checked when we are dealing with some sort of social and human health impact assessment because of some sort of climate extremes. When we are talking about health risk, there are climate related hazards like extreme weather events, heat, sea level rises, and all of them are in some way another way basically creating some sort of health risk problem in a certain region. Why people have been exposed? Probably because of the communities or some sort of resilience or low resilience or awareness or infrastructure which is not appropriate, or energy system, water system, food system, health providing systems like that. Those should be monitored, and those should be up to date based on the technological advancement, so that we should have a less number of people should be exposed to climate change or climate extremes conditions like that. Then in this particular lecture, we have also talked about social and psychological consequences. We talked about what are the effect of climate extremes on social and psychological consequences. Let us say people are moving from one place to another place, that is a migration issue. That is basically one of the very key issues we have seen during the climate extreme. What happens, suppose in one particular areas there is a floods, droughts, heat waves, or certain different types of very quick disasters occurs, flash flood for example, or wildfire or something like that, which are hydrometeorological extreme events. People, homes, personal property has been disrupted. They displace themselves to some other places, more safer places, forced to leave their original communities. they migrate from one place to the another place and they settle in those areas which are already overcrowded. So, what is the problem in that? Basically, when we have overcrowded urban spaces, it is basically increasing the exposure of more climate extremes. So, it is kind of a domino effect in those areas like that. Then we have also talked about mental health issues, where we have talked about post trauma stress disasters like that. We have talked about anxiety, depression, long term trauma, when people are suffering from some sort of disaster prone areas, so that we have better mental and psychological counseling centers, so that they can help these people, and then so they should recover from those extreme conditions as well. There is a social inequality, rural areas with good infrastructure or informal settlements, or some sort of discriminative societies, or low income urban neighborhoods like that. That are also key players when we are talking about social and psychological exposure to the climate extreme conditions like that. Then we have talked about impact on food and water security. So, if you look at this particular map, you see that here a lots of areas, primarily those areas which are developing economies, low income economies, where we have seen the low food insecurity. So, here in these areas we see that particularly area like Mali, Central African region, Malawi, Zimbabwe like that, these are the areas which are hotspots, and here the food and water security is the major challenge. When you are talking about any climate extremes, we essentially refer to those areas where these climate extremes can directly affect the food and water availability, and therefore it directly affects the people status, and therefore we have to look at those hotspots where these are more common. So, we have talked about drought impact cycle. We have talked about if we have lesser amount of water availability these areas, water contamination can be the biggest issue. Then we have also talked about different types of direct effect on different age groups in the climate extreme conditions as well. Then in the third lecture, we have talked about what is the overall climate risk in the developing regions like that. We have talked about extreme events conditions, different extreme sea level rise. We have also talked about why the particular developing regions are more prone to climate extreme conditions, limited infrastructures or limited infrastructures for which can save them towards climate extreme conditions like that, or let us say they are totally dependent upon some sort of similar types of economical activities, and when a particular climate extremes occurs, and that basically disrupt the whole economy, and therefore whole nations is suffers because of the particular climate extremes. So, we have talked about this. What could be the adaptation strategies? We have to strengthen our forecasting capabilities, we have to improve our data collection method, enhance weather monitoring, modeling, the communication network we have to strengthening, community level preparedness plan we have to also adopt, training of local communities, setting up the emergency shelters and equipment of emergency services. Some of the areas which needs to be we have to improve, so that we can better manage those climate extremes in the developing areas, particularly low income areas like that. Then we have also talked about agricultural strategies, for example, drought resistant crops. We have talked about efficient irrigation techniques, so that they can use lesser water but more productivities like that. Then we have also talked about let us say different types of climate extremes which are co-occurring at the same time. Flood resistance we have to talk about, extreme rainfall conditions, storm resistance system, or heat wave resistance system. We should use some sort of different materials which can protect those heat wave or hot extreme conditions. Rainfall endurance, roads, or those we have to basically that can adapt to the climate extremes conditions as well. Then we have talked about particularly in the low income societies, what is the role of international cooperations. You talk about UN, UNFCCC, or let us say you talk about multiple different organizations, EC mode particularly, let us say in Nepal. So, there are they have set up to advance the sciences, to advance the to provide essential services. For example, global agreements they do, adaptation committee they do, Warsaw International Mechanism they do some sort of mechanism, financial support they provide, and based on all these mechanism they do different types of tasks, and those tasks is targeting towards the minimizing the negative consequences of these climate extreme events like that. So, there is a significant role of these UN based or global international corporations, which basically trying to mitigate the negative consequences of these climate extremes in those countries which are really exposed, and they are also working towards to increase the resilience or awareness in those areas, because when we are talking about climate extremes, climate change conditions, climate extremes are going to be increased frequencies and magnitude, and therefore we have to be better prepared for those conditions as well. These regional and international cooperations are basically important for knowledge sharing, joint initiatives, whether it could be NGOs, local government or UN bodies or world bodies like that. They also tries to increase the funds that can be used for, let us say in a disaster time period for recovery, that is the regional climate funds, and they are also trying to enhance the resilience of a particular societies in the low economies areas and lower middle income economies or developing regions like that. So, there are several types of financial mechanism they have proposed, and these mechanisms are primarily used for supporting those people who are living in these particular regions like that. Then we have in the particular this particular lecture we have also talked about what could be the future directions for adaptation. So, primarily we talked about capacity building, participatory decision making, and the local governance, that could be community led adaptive initiatives. On the other hand, when you are talking about the advancement of these predictions or understanding of climate extremes, we have to improve our advanced data collection, early warning system, resource allocations, proactive measures, and long term environmental trends, if we can assess through that modeling framework or some sort of statistical framework like that. We can also try to incorporate indigenous agricultural practices, water conservation methods, natural resources management and cultural relevance, so that we can have integrated indigenous knowledge with the advanced technologies, and that can be safe for future generation as well, and can mitigate the effect of these climate extremes as well. So, we have started with the socio-economic development, socio-economic impact. Then we talked about health and social and psychological impact of climate extremes, and then towards the end of this particular week we have talked about what is the impact particularly on those areas which are really exposed, particularly the low economies or lower middle economies areas, and how different types of adaptation steps from the local government or the world organization or community based resilience system or community awareness system we can incorporate, or let us say indigenous system we can incorporate to basically mitigate these climate extremes effects in those particular areas like that. So, this is the this week we have discussed all of these, covered all these topics. For the assignment, you can primarily look at what is the impact of extreme climatic events on food production. You can take any example of wheat production, rice production, maize productions, and you can relate with the climate extremes and you can try to calculate it. Let us say if you have flood years, drought years, normal years, how these yields has been changed. That is some sort of very simple economical model, and that can be used for very simple understanding, but it can be further modified for advanced applications in different parts. So, you can try using this assignment, and we can discuss about this assignment in the next class. Thank you so much for your attention.